Do you know what to expect in part 1 of the IELTS speaking test? In English, we say you never get a second chance to make a first impression, and IELTS part 1 is where you make your first impression. So in today's video, we're going to talk about what to expect and some strategies to help you shine. My name is Kevin. I am an English teacher with over 10 years experience for IELTS speaking, and I'm also a former IELTS speaking examiner. So in this video, we're going to talk about some tips I give my own students and some mistakes that I hear when I used to examine. So first, let's give a brief overview of part 1. Part 1 is really your first interaction with the IELTS examiner. It's going to last about 5 minutes. It cannot last more than 5 minutes, and depending on your answers and how quickly the examiner can move through the questions they must ask, it could end a little earlier. Quite honestly, I don't remember any part 1 ending before 4 minutes 30 seconds unless the candidate was really low level and simply couldn't give me the answers I needed. That's because as an examiner, I have mandatory questions that I must ask, and then I have one group of questions that I must ask. If I still have time, I can then move on to a second group of questions to ask. But I must ask the mandatory, and I must ask at least one set. So, what is in those mandatory questions that I must ask? That is either going to be about where you live, your hometown now, your apartment now, your house, or it's going to be about what you do now. That is, do you work or are you a student? You will definitely get one of those questions. So be prepared. Other part 1 questions are usually familiar topics like free time, shopping, friends and family. Although recently I've noticed they've gotten a little stranger. For example, questions about the stars, questions about watches, questions about money, things like that. They are not as intense as part 2 and part 3 because the purpose of part 1 is really to warm you up. You're getting used to the examiner is getting used to you. Now, it's important to remember that does not mean that part 1 is worth anything less than part 2 and part 3. The IELTS exam is graded as a whole. I am not looking just at part 1, just at part 2, just at part 3. I'm looking for everything. So while part 1 questions are usually designed to be answered a little shorter than part 3 certainly, and of course part 2 is different altogether, that doesn't mean I want you to give 1 or 2 word answers. If I ask you, where do you live now? Do you live in a house or an apartment? I don't want you to say, I live in an apartment. It's simply too short. As I've said before, IELTS is a speaking exam, and I want you to speak. So tell me, I live in an apartment in Long Bien district in Hanoi. I don't know if you know, but Long Bien is across the river from the rest of the city and is not as busy. So my apartment tends to be in a quieter neighborhood, and there's lots of little cafes nearby. That's great. I've used example, I've used elaboration, and I previously talked to you about this. To extend your part 1 answer, elaborate. Give me more information. Give me examples. What do you mean? Give me a concrete examples. Or give me emotion through a story. Here, tell me about the time you moved into your apartment. Tell me how excited you were. Tell me you were sad because it was the first time you moved away from your family. Remember, we do not want to be talking for 2 or 3 minutes in a part 1 question. And in fact, the examiner will stop you because they must ask certain questions. But that still doesn't mean I want a 1-sentence answer. Answer it how you would in Vietnamese. Think of that. You wouldn't just say, I live in an apartment. You tell me where it is. You tell me how many rooms it had. You would tell me when you moved in. All those natural things that you would say, I want you to say here. As I told you earlier, part 1 usually focuses on certain common areas, and I gave you a list, and I'm sure you can find other lists from your teachers or online. It's a good idea to familiarize yourself with vocabulary you would use for these things. Again, I previously talked about precise language. It's not a matter of using as much advanced vocabulary as you can. It's a matter of using exact language when necessary. As I said before, part 1 is usually about more common everyday topics. So it shouldn't be hard to familiarize yourself with vocabulary that would be helpful when answering a part 1 question. In fact, you probably already know it. But still, think about what you could say about your family. Think about what you could say about your hobbies. Think about what you could say about your friends, what you do in your free time. That being said, don't make the mistake of drafting model answers and memorizing them. For example, I told you that you will definitely be asked about your what you do now or where you live. Do not memorize answers. The examiner will be able to tell. You will not sound natural, and it will affect your score. Memorizing answers is always a bad idea, and it's a complete and total waste of time to study by memorizing answers. Looking up vocabulary, looking up idiomatic phrases, looking up other things to relate to other topics, okay, that's great. But until you start speaking them out loud, until you're using them in a fluent way, that's where you should focus. And that leads me to my tips to you to build confidence. As I've told you so many times before, focus on fluency over accuracy. This is the first time you're speaking with your examiner, and it really sets the tone for the rest of the test because your examiner is getting to know you. This is their first ability to assess your level. Focus on fluency. You're going to make mistakes. Even very high-level IELTS students make mistakes. Even native speakers make mistakes. So don't think that you have to sit there and be perfect. And don't let the worry about being perfect affect the speed, the flow, the coherence of your answer, because that's really going to affect your score. Fluency is so much better than perfection. Trust me. Another is to have a variety of sentence structures. There's nothing wrong with peppering in some simpler sentences. Oh yes, I really like reading. But almost always a better answer is to say, oh yes, I really like reading. It's one of my favorite hobbies because it really helps me relax after school. I've built a more complex sentence. I've given you a little more detail, and that's a better answer overall. Also, remember, usually the examiner is going to follow up with another question about the topic. Finally, I always think it's a good idea to practice IELTS speaking with a timer. It really gives you an idea of how long you're speaking and how long you could potentially maybe should be speaking. For example, a part 1, as I told you, will have to be completed within 5 minutes. The examiner is going to ask you a set of questions about what you do and also or about where you live, and then they're going to ask you at least one more set of questions. If you find practice questions online or from your teacher, answer them with a timer to give you an idea of how long you're speaking. In my experience, students often think they're speaking longer than they actually are. And remember, In the exam room, you will not have a clock. You will not know how long you are speaking. Your examiner will, but you will not be able to see it. So it's a good idea to get a general idea about how long you're answering. This is true for part 1 and definitely part 2, but also the entire test. If you're speaking, if you're practicing out loud, time yourself. And you should be practicing out loud. Frequently, I see students who are trying to study, they will read the question, and then I will see them talking quietly or maybe just moving their lips as they answer in their head. That's completely different than building fluency. Remember, I want you to be used to speaking confidently and smoothly. I want you to be building fluency. And the only way to do that is by speaking. So if you're alone, record yourself. Listen back. Do you hear any pronunciation errors? Do you hear any intonation errors? Do you hear any way you can improve the answer? It's not about being exact. It's about working and improving and building those fluency muscles. So that's our overview of part 1. I think sometimes students tend to think that part 1 is really not that important, and it is. As I said, it's when your examiner hears you for the first time. It's when you hear the examiner for the first time. And as an examiner, I was always really trying to figure out what band this student was going to fall in. Because it helped me know what to anticipate in part 2 and part 3. I've told you how to practice. I think recording is great, and definitely timing yourself. So if you found this video helpful, subscribe, share with your friends. Please leave me a thumbs up. And also let me know in the comments down below, what part 1 topic do you find most difficult? Or how do you prepare for part 1 topics? I would love to hear your thoughts, and I will definitely respond. So until next time, happy study.